Hi, Craig. Welcome back to the Free Speech Cage.
Good morning, Max. Good to be back here. Thanks for having me.
So, I understand you saw one of my favorite movies that I will rant about. I'm sure I've ranted to you, but you probably just tuned off immediately.
Yeah, I saw 3 Days of the Condor for the first time last night.
Right. So, before I tell you how I would put the context of that movie, what was your takeaway?
Nothing changes. Nothing changes. Down to talking about this huge, massive government agency, interior, hidden spy thing chasing Venezuelan oil. This was a 1975 movie, and its core was chasing Venezuelan oil and how many people had to die to get the American government to take over Venezuela and their oil.
Yeah, it's so yeah. I just want to explain some of the backgrounds of that movie that I'm sure was known to the filmmakers, but isn't in the movie, and it's not talked about today. So in 1955, there's this guy M. King Hubbard, and he worked in the oil industry, and he looked at the number of wells that were found, how much reserves they had, and how much they were pumping out until they started to deplete. And so he graphed where American oil was going, and we're talking about Texas Permian Basin. And he calculated that basically we'd reach peak oil around 1974, 1975, which is when that movie came out. And
And when was the energy crisis? 72? 73?
well, basically it was there are a couple of them, like the early 70s and then the 1979, the tanker wars, whatever. So there were a few of them at the time. So you can very easily get into the weeds on all this stuff, but uh, essentially, the one of the reasons that the Middle East started to cut off the oil was because they didn't like the U.S. Militarizing Israel so much. I mean, they knew what was happening. They knew that the U.S. was using Israel as like a permanent aircraft carrier to basically keep them in line. So they pulled back on the oil, and people in the industry back then, just as today, some believed in the Hubbard peak oil theory, and some people didn't. But those that would believe in it a little bit would go to the government, and that's something that's not understood today. That it isn't like Trump isn't thinking, "Oh, I'm going to, blow up some boats in Venezuela." It's the oil industry that will come to him and say, "Listen, we need to get this oil in Venezuela, so we're going to need to, basically keep China out, keep Russia out, whatever. We need to stop this stuff, so we're going to need to embargo essentially Venezuela." That's why they're doing the boats. It's all just preparation to put an embargo on the whole Venezuela. So anyway, but back then in the 70s, they too were like, okay, well, our American companies, British companies, we built the wells over there in the Middle East, and no, they're not going to have control over this. So we need to make sure that our supply is good for that oil. So the CIA would have a plan to do these things over there, to change governments to keep the oil. I mean, yes, that's been going on from day one, and what 3 Days of the Condor is about. I mean, to me, what it's really about, I mean, it's at the end of the movie, is that the U.S. is going to do whatever it needs to do to secure foreign sources of oil or to control those sources, like who gets it. It's going to militarize something like Israel to protect its interests. It has Guam, it has the whole South China Seas. I mean, it's been dealing with this thing for a long time. And what makes the movie great is that what it's really saying is that people don't care how they get the oil as long as they get it.
So that's one of the points. I don't even know if you'd call him a protagonist, but there's this CIA operator who at the end tells Robert Redford, who is also a CIA agent who gets stuck in the middle of this very violent plot when he unwittingly discovers a pattern that leads to a hidden cell within the CIA that's planning a war against Venezuela to take over the Venezuelan oil fields. And this CIA guy says to Robert Redford at the end, he says, hey, people in 25 years, I think he used 25 years, which is 50 years ago. So he said, there's going to be shortages, whether it's water or oil or energy, or he used food as an example too. He says, at that moment, when there are shortages, people aren't going to ask how you got what it is that they're short, oil, food, water. They're going to ask, where is it? And if you don't plan for it ahead of time, it's not going to be there. And so, as you say, people really don't care where this stuff comes from, as long as they don't know how horrible it might be, or they can fed better. They want the cars, the lights, the food, the this and that. And, if we got to topple governments here and there, that's what we've done forever. And the 3 Days of the Condor was just mind-blowing.
Well, I think what I love about the 3 Days of the Condor is, again, from the filmmaker's point of view, from people who are following this, Robert Redford represents the public. He's not a CIA operative, right? He's just an analyst. I mean, he could be working at a think tank or something. They're basically just working at a think tank. So he's an analyst. He's just reading the news, coming up with these interpretations. They all are,
right. And the secretary admits people in and out. They had a security camera that she'd see who was there. She had a gun in her desk, and you think, oh, it's because she's CIA. It turns out she was afraid of getting raped, so she carried a gun. Had nothing to do with the CIA position.
Oh yeah. Nobody's worried about them, but he's like the public. He's completely naive. As educated as he is, he's doing all this research, and he doesn't believe that there are people looking at oil or resources and that they are doing everything they can to make sure that they can keep those oil and resources for themselves or for us. That's the fundamental problem. So in the movie, when they talk to him, when they read him that he's like, no, this is wrong, you kill people, it's wrong. That's the only reason they're going after him. Now, if he had said on the phone when the first guy calls, he says, oh, I didn't realize that, I didn't realize this is such a big thing that we've got onto it. Oh, thank God we found them, we have to protect our resources. They would have been fine. But the branch of the CIA that's dealing with this, that's actually being informed by the oil industry, they're not they don't care about the analysis. Their whole agenda is, we need to get the resources for us. That's our job. And like I said, they already knew back then that I'm sure the genesis of the movie is people looking at the bell curve and just extrapolating, like, okay, not the bell curve, the Hubbard's peak curve. So if peak oil is true, now peak oil, remember, he predicted it would be peak oil in 1974, something like that. So when the movie is made is when he predicted that peak oil would happen.
And it was also, I believe, 2 years after the energy crisis where people were lining up for hours to fill up their cars with gas. I think that was 74.
Right, but people understood it as a commercial difference between these Middle Eastern countries and the United States. They didn't understand it as an actual war between these two places, between the exercise of brute power to get what you want. And again, he didn't see it either. Like, nobody is they're not following this. The people in the CIA that are doing these plans, they're looking at the data. And that's what the irony is to me, is that Robert Redford should know better. He should have known about peak oil. He should have known about the difference. But he's just like the public. He has his head completely up his you-know-what.
Yes, and blissfully so, until something happens and he gets stuck in the middle of it, and then sort of he is his own version of the public, is outraged, and also trying to save his skin, which both of those things happen. He fights back and saves his own skin. But one of the things you're highlighting, Max, is energy is hugely important to society, to American society, but to other places. Natural resources. So if we go back to 1750, 1760, 1770, the British government was logging American trees, North American trees, for their navy, and they would put these marks on specific trees that were big enough to be masts, which were incredibly rare and incredibly important for British power protection. So for Americans living in Maine and New Hampshire and so forth, that projection of British might to take natural resources that they viewed as theirs, these incredibly rare trees, that led in ways to the American Revolution. And we see over and over again from the dawn of time until today this struggle for resources, whatever those resources might be. And on the face, it's people talking and voting, but there's violence, there's coercion, there's bribery, there's all sorts of stuff in the background. Sometimes, as we're seeing now, it's not even in the background. And Robert Redford's character, he's in the front, and then all of a sudden he pulls the curtain back, or someone pulls it back for him, and he's in the middle of all this stuff that's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, he's getting a lesson, and I don't even feel he gets it at the end. I mean, that's why the guy's like, you can go to the Times. You're so sure they'll print this story. I don't know that they will print the story, and they wouldn't, or if they did, nobody would pay attention. And that's the point he's trying to get across. The ending of the movie is saying that, like, listen, there's like you say, there's always a battle for resources from nations, companies, whatever, and it's to the death because the stakes are so high. So the question is for those CIA operatives, they're like, okay, we have this plan to try, we're working on getting the government we want. And it means the difference between gasoline being, today's dollars being between $6 or $3. We already know what the public wants. They're not going to say it because they don't follow it, they don't care. But we know if it goes up to $6 a gallon, there's going to be violence in the street, the government's going to break down. We know all that. So what's it worth for us to get $3 a gallon gas? And they're like, well, it is worth to kill 12 of our own people because that's what the stakes are. And this is as true today as it was back then. So when the government looks at these people in these boats, they know they're just making a very hard calculus that, yeah, it's not, these guys shouldn't be killed. I mean, but, we have to cordon off Venezuela. We have to get the Venezuelan oil back, and it's going to cost the lives initially of these 80 poor saps that are in these boats.
I think it's over 100 now. Hit 99 the other day.
It can go to thousands because, again, you're talking about stakes that are so huge. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but right now, we're again at peak oil. Well, what saved the 70s, because...
Fracking.
Well, no, actually, it was before that even. What saved the 70s was the...
North Shore? North Slope.
Well, no, North Sea saved basically Europe or Britain. And then for us, it was though that was a little bit later on, for us it was the Gulf of Mexico. It was off deep sea drilling, and then it was the Prudhoe Bay in Alaska. So from the 1980s on, that happened. But then that started to go down. And then fracking started to really make headway in 2008. So then we had the fracking thing. But now fracking is going down. So once again, we're at a point where we're at the downward slope of a peak oil. And that's why now you have the Ukraine situation, the Israeli situation. But even those are complicated to explain. But I think it's very obvious to explain what's happening in Venezuela. People have to remember that Venezuela and the United States used to be basically partners. We sold them weapons. We built refineries in Texas just for heavy crude from Venezuela. The only reason we haven't gone to Venezuela in the past 10, 20 years or, gotten the oil back, so to speak, is because of the fracking. The fracking was doing so much oil, it was like, man, we don't need them. But now that the fracking is declining, now these American companies are like, the Venezuelan oil is still ours, and, just been saving it, and now we're going to go back to it. And again, the public has no idea. And the public, what decision would the public make? And so, 3 Days of the Condor could be made again today, right? You could have like a team of CIA research scientists, right, on a boat exploring oil or something in Venezuela or whatever, and they find this big, like, U.S. is building some submarine base, whatever, who
Right.
knows what, right? Exactly, just you could do the script word for word until the end, and at the end, somebody would say, "I'm going to go to Tucker Carlson with what's going on," and the guy would be like,
Go ahead.
"Yeah, go ahead." So
Well, much to talk about there.
yeah, so okay, so how long have I ranted on that? Oh, 15 minutes. Oh my God. But as I've told you, I could go for hours.
Well, I look forward to going for hours, but we'll break it up.
All right. Thanks for coming, Craig.
Thanks, Maxie.